The year was 1947, and the United States was breathing optimism. World War II had ended, soldiers were returning home, and the country was entering the golden age of the post-war era. American families wanted new houses, modern appliances, and, above all, automobiles. Millions of people had saved during years of rationing and restrictions, waiting for the moment to buy the car of their dreams. But there was a problem. The available automobiles were basically the same designs from before the war, barely with some cosmetic changes. Detroit, the all-powerful American automotive capital, dominated by General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, was in no hurry to innovate. Why should they? They had the captive market, the established factories, and consumers were lining up to buy whatever they produced. In the midst of that panorama of corporate conformism appeared a man with a different vision. His name was Preston Thomas Tucker, a 43-year-old entrepreneur from Michigan with experience in automotive design but without his own company. Tucker had worked in the industry for years, designing components, experimenting with ideas, dreaming of creating something revolutionary. And in his mind burned a simple but powerful question: why did cars have to be so dangerous, so outdated, so boring? Why couldn't there be an automobile that truly took advantage of all the technology developed during the war to create something safe, fast, and completely new? Tucker decided he would build it himself. It would be the car of the future, and he would call it simply the Tucker 48. What Preston Tucker designed in 1947 was not just a different car. It was a declaration of war against everything Detroit represented. While the Big Three continued producing heavy, noisy, and frankly dangerous machines, Tucker imagined something radically different. The Tucker 48 would have a third central headlight that turned with the steering wheel to illuminate curves. It would include seat belts in all seats, something practically non-existent at the time. The engine would be mounted in the rear, improving balance and traction. The windshield would shoot outward in case of impact, preventing passengers from flying through the glass. It would have a padded compartment in front of the passenger seat where occupants could take refuge in case of a crash. And it wasn't just safety. The aerodynamic design was decades ahead of its time, with smooth and elegant lines that looked like they came from a science fiction movie. The six-cylinder aluminum engine could propel the car to more than 120 miles per hour. The independent suspension on all four wheels promised smooth and stable handling. It was, in every sense, the automobile that America deserved, but that Detroit refused to build. Tucker needed two fundamental things to make his dream a reality: money and a factory. For the factory, he had an incredible stroke of luck. The War Assets Administration leased him the gigantic Dodge plant in Chicago, a massive facility that had produced aircraft engines during the war and was now empty. It was perfect. Huge, modern, well located. Money was more complicated. Tucker was a born salesman, a brilliant showman who knew how to capture the public's imagination. He launched an aggressive advertising campaign, buying full pages in national magazines, promising the car of the future. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of people sent deposits to reserve a Tucker, some even without ever having seen it. In June of 1947, Tucker announced the grand premiere of his prototype, nicknamed Tin Goose, in a spectacular ceremony in Chicago. More than 5,000 people attended. It was supposed to be the moment of triumph, the undeniable proof that Tucker's vision was real. But behind the curtain, it was chaos. The prototype had serious problems. Suspension parts had broken under the weight of the heavy batteries. The car barely worked. While Tucker and his team gave long speeches on stage, desperately stretching out the event, workers frantically worked behind the scenes, trying to fix the car enough to roll it out. When the Tin Goose finally appeared, it moved slowly, almost ceremonially. The crowd applauded, the journalists took photos, and Tucker smiled. But he knew the truth. He had just pulled off automotive theater, not engineering. The car existed, yes, but it wasn't ready, not even close. Still, the media was fascinated. Specialized magazines called it revolutionary. The public adored it. Tucker had bought himself more time, but the clock was ticking louder than ever. Preston Tucker seemed about to achieve the impossible, challenge Detroit and win. But behind the shine and promises, reality was much more complicated. Building an automobile from scratch was not like selling an idea. It required precise engineering, reliable supply chains, trained workers, and rigorous quality control. And above all, it required massive amounts of constant money. Tucker had raised over $28 million, a considerable sum but insufficient for what he was trying to achieve. The Big Three of Detroit had decades of infrastructure, thousands of established suppliers, consolidated relationships with distributors. Tucker was starting from zero, competing against titans who had no interest in seeing him succeed. And then the problems began. Suppliers who had promised components started backing out or delaying deliveries. Some openly admitted that Detroit had pressured them not to work with Tucker. Steel was scarce in the post-war period, and mysteriously Tucker's allocations always seemed to be delayed or reduced. The press, which had initially been enthusiastic, began to change tone. Articles began appearing questioning the viability of the project, suggesting that Tucker was more smoke than substance, an imprudent dreamer playing with naive investors' money. But the most devastating blow came from where Tucker least expected it: the federal government. On May 28, 1948, just as Tucker was desperately trying to begin mass production, the Securities and Exchange Commission, together with the Justice Department, opened an investigation into Tucker Corporation for possible fraud in the sale of securities. The accusations were serious. The SEC alleged that Tucker had exaggerated the capabilities of his automobile, that he had used investors' money inappropriately, that he had made false claims about distribution contracts and production capacity. Basically, they accused him of mounting an elaborate scheme to defraud investors and consumers. It wasn't just bureaucratic paperwork. That morning, federal investigators swarmed the Chicago plant like an invading army. They demanded documents, interrogated workers, and sealed offices. Tucker had no choice but to stop production immediately and send everyone home. In a single day, he had to lay off 1,600 workers, 1,600 people who lost their jobs, 1,600 families affected, 1,600 witnesses to Tucker's humiliation. The massive plant, which days before hummed with activity and hope, became a tomb of silence. For Tucker, it was like receiving a bullet in the chest. It didn't matter if the accusations were true or not. The simple fact of being under federal investigation instantly destroyed his credibility. Banks closed credit lines. Suppliers demanded advance payment. Potential investors fled. Distributors canceled contracts. The media campaign intensified. Columnist Drew Pearson, one of the most influential journalists in the United States, began publishing devastating articles about Tucker, calling him a fraud, a scammer, and a charlatan. Other media followed suit. Suddenly, the visionary innovator had become the national villain. Tucker tried to defend himself. He gave interviews, wrote letters, hired lawyers. He insisted that everything was a conspiracy orchestrated by Detroit to eliminate him before he could threaten their dominance. And he was probably right, at least partially. Years later, documents would come to light showing how some Detroit executives had actively worked to sabotage Tucker. But by then, the damage was already done. Tucker Corporation was bleeding financially. Every day without production meant more debts, more unpaid suppliers, more laid-off workers. The dream was becoming a nightmare. Preston Tucker made a desperate decision. He would produce the cars anyway, even if it was by the skin of his teeth, even if he had to improvise, even if the whole world was against him. He would prove that his vision was real, that the Tucker 48 was not smoke and mirrors, but a genuine, functional, revolutionary automobile. During the summer of 1948, while the SEC investigation hung over his head like a guillotine, Tucker and his team worked day and night at the Chicago plant. It was controlled chaos. Parts were missing, so they improvised. Designs changed on the fly. Engineers solved problems in real time that normally would have taken months of development. But it worked. In September of 1948, the first fully functional Tucker 48 came off the production line. Then came the second. After that, the third. One by one, those beautiful sea green automobiles began to materialize. By March 3, 1949, when operations were forced to a halt, roughly 37 cars had been assembled. Later, with parts already in hand, a few more were completed, bringing the final total to 51, including the prototype. They weren't the thousands he had promised, but they were real, they were functional, and they were exactly as impressive as he had promised. Journalists who tested them were amazed. The car could reach speeds over 120 miles per hour. The handling was smooth. The safety features worked perfectly. And then came the moment that should have changed everything. Tucker sent 7 of his cars to Indianapolis Motor Speedway for endurance testing. It was the ultimate proof, the definitive answer to all his critics. The 7 Tuckers ran lap after lap, maintaining an average speed of 90 miles per hour. They held up under punishing conditions, proving the car was real and remarkably capable. Hour after hour, those cars demonstrated that everything Tucker had promised was true. The car worked. It was fast. It was reliable. It was real. Even some of his harshest critics had to admit, Preston Tucker had built something special. The Indianapolis tests were irrefutable proof that the Tucker 48 was not a fantasy or a fraud, but a genuine automotive achievement. But it was already too late. On June 10, 1949, the federal government indicted Preston Tucker and 7 executives of his company on 31 counts of fraud, conspiracy, and violations of securities laws. The trial became a media circus, and it formally began on October 4, 1949. For months, prosecutors and defense attorneys presented evidence, called witnesses, argued about every detail of Tucker Corporation's operations. The prosecution painted Tucker as a sophisticated scammer who had built an elaborate Ponzi scheme using money from new investors to pay previous ones while pocketing millions. They presented evidence of questionable expenses, unfulfilled promises, unrealistic timelines. The defense argued that Tucker was simply an ambitious entrepreneur operating in a hostile industry, that all delays and problems were the result of external sabotage and the normal difficulties of any automotive startup. They showed the 51 cars produced as evidence that the vision was real and viable. They presented the Indianapolis test results as undeniable proof. The trial lasted almost 3 months. Finally, in January of 1950, the jury returned with its verdict, not guilty on all charges. Preston Tucker was completely acquitted. It should have been a victory, a vindication, proof that he was right, that he was innocent, that the system had tried to crush him and had failed. But in reality, it was a hollow victory, because while Tucker fought in the courts, his company had died. By the time the trial ended, Tucker Corporation was financially destroyed. The investigation and legal process had consumed the last resources. Investors had left. Suppliers had cut relationships. The Chicago plant was silent, empty, ghostly. In total, exactly 51 Tucker 48s were produced. 51 of the approximately 1,000 that Tucker had promised. 51 of what should have been an automotive revolution. Some of those cars were sold to the public. Others remained in the hands of investors, employees, and creditors. Tucker desperately tried to revive the company after the trial, but nobody wanted to invest in a brand marked by scandal, regardless of the innocence verdict. By 1951, everything was officially over. Tucker Corporation declared bankruptcy. The factory was sold, the tools auctioned, the dream buried. Preston Tucker spent the rest of his life insisting that Detroit had sabotaged him, that the Big Three had orchestrated his downfall because they feared competition. He died in 1956, at 53 years old, from lung cancer. He never built another automobile. 75 years later, the question remains fascinating and disturbing. What really killed the Tucker 48? Was it a deliberate conspiracy? Certainly there is evidence of interference from Detroit. Suppliers who admitted to pressures, press articles that seemed coordinated, an SEC investigation that many considered excessive and selective. The timing was too convenient, the obstacles too systematic. But it is also true that Tucker was inexperienced in mass manufacturing. He had dramatically underestimated costs. His promises were often more ambitious than realistic. The company had serious management problems. Even without external sabotage, building an automotive company from scratch was almost impossible. Perhaps the answer is both. Perhaps Detroit saw a potential threat and decided to eliminate it while it was vulnerable. And perhaps Tucker, brilliant as he was, simply did not have the resources, experience, or capital to survive even in the best scenario. What is undeniable is that the Tucker 48 was genuinely innovative. Many of its features eventually became industry standard. Directional headlights, aerodynamic design, rear engines in some models, and above all, focus on safety. It took decades, but Tucker's ideas finally won. The 51 Tucker 48s that survive today are collectible treasures, valued at millions of dollars each. They are tangible reminders of what could have been, of an alternative future where innovation won over established power. The story of Preston Tucker is romantic, inspiring, tragic. It is the perfect archetype of the underdog versus the system of the visionary, crushed by larger forces. And there is truth in that narrative. But it is also a cautionary tale about the brutal realities of industrial capitalism. No matter how brilliant your idea, no matter how superior your product, if you don't have the capital, infrastructure, and political power to sustain it, you will probably fail. The market doesn't always reward the best technology. Sometimes it rewards power, patience, and the ability to survive. Did Detroit kill Tucker? Probably it mortally wounded him. Could Tucker have survived without that interference? Maybe, but the odds were long from the beginning. What remains is the eternal question that keeps this story alive. How many other brilliant innovations have died similarly? How many other visionaries were silenced before they could change the world? How many alternative futures did we lose because the system preferred to protect the present? Preston Tucker built 51 cars that embarrassed everything Detroit produced. And for that unforgivable crime of being too good, too soon, he paid the highest price. His dream died, but his legend, 75 years later, remains alive. And those 51 cars keep rolling, beautiful and melancholic reminders of what America could have been if it had had the courage to believe in its visionaries instead of protecting its giants.